Political Ignominy, Ivy Day. This was Joyce's favourite of his own novellas. If Cyclops satirises the disproportionately vast ambition of Irish nationalism, then inversely Ivy Day, written in 1905, satirises the Irish political situation, which derived its meaning in relative proportion from the presence of an invisible giant, present and alive in people's minds. This, it could be said, is the Lilliputian method of satire at work, reducing everything by reference to a superior, larger being. On this 6th of October, a group of Dubliners from various social strata assemble in Wicklow Street to make their preparations for a municipal election, and the day is the anniversary of Parnell's death. Some of the agents, assembling at the end of a rainy day, have remembered this and wear an ivy leaf behind their lapel. The ivy is perennially green, but memory is less lasting. This 6 October soon appears as a day of forgetfulness, of shame, or of inconvenient recollections. The agents discuss local politics, and their conversation bear witness to the disintegration of political and moral values that has come about since the leader's death. The rain matches both the mourning of the past and the sadness of the present, while the imagery that lights up the darker corners of this evening and its events only accentuates the shadows. In the small bare room, the ancient caretaker fans a fire which is in danger of being choked by ashes, and the commemoration begins under the auspices of a dying fire, guarded by a weeping old man. The phoenix would find it difficult to arise from these ashes, and despite the direct allusion to resurrection in the poem recited at the end, they had their way, they laid him low, but Erin, list, his spirit may rise like the phoenix from the flames when breaks the dawning of the day. It is clear that there is no faith now, and that no one really wishes to revive the spirit of Parnell, for he would be too intransigent and too honest to suit anyone in this new generation, except perhaps, this is the Triestine socialist Joyce speaking, the workers. But the workers would have very little chance in competition with the two parties capable of financing election campaigns, the Nationalist Party in whose favour the Conservative candidate has stood down, and the unnamed party of Mr. Tierney, for which the O'Connors, Croftons, Henchies and Lyons are working. It is Joe Hines who speaks up for the working classes, in Marxist terms, which suggests that all the virtues have taken refuge among the proletariat. The working man, said Mr. Haynes, gets all kicks and no halfpence. But its labour produces everything. The working man is not looking for fat jobs for his sons and nephews and cousins. The working man is not going to drag the honour of Dublin in the mud to please a German monarch. How's that? Said the old man. Don't you know they want to present an address of welcome to Edward Rex if he comes here next year? What do we want kowtowing to a foreign king? We shall see that Joe Hines, a tall, slender young man with a light brown moustache who looks like Joyce, is a loyalist, as his friend O'Connor says. Poor Joe is a decent skin. He clearly has a sense of humour, a certain firmness, and real loyalty to Parnell and to the socialist creed. If Parnell were alive, say Hines, O'Connor, and Old Jack, things would be different now. And Old Jack says, Musha, God be with them times. There was some life in it then. And this is true. Then Parnell was God. But the door opens, and a little man bustles in, hurries to the fire, rubbing his hands as if he intended to produce a spark from them, and Mr. Henchy has arrived. It can be seen that he does not like Hines, or the working class, or the hillsiders and Fenians, whom he confuses together and insults in a most conventional fashion. Some of these hillsiders and Fenians are a bit too clever, if you ask me, said Mr. Henchy. Do you know what my private and candid opinion is about some of those little jokers? I believe half of them are in the pay of the castle, that is, of the English government. In the half-light there come and go various representatives of the alienation from which Dublin suffers, the most typical being the indefinable person, resembling a poor clergyman or a poor actor, whose face has the appearance of damp yellow cheese, and whose voice is discreet, indulgent, velvety. It eventually turns out that he is a poor, unbeneficed priest, travelling on his own account. Everything rings false in this devalued world, except the elementary desires. Everyone is thirsty and impatiently awaits the arrival of the promised bottles of stout. Here can be observed the beginnings of that downgrading technique Joyce was to use so freely in Ulysses. Just as the Princess Nausicaa is replaced by a lame schoolgirl, the times of Parnell and his glory are cheapened by the succeeding age. The ambitions of Ireland are limited to the consumption of alcohol, and Mr. Henchy, the most active and unscrupulous of the Dubliners present, burlesques the rise of a citizen to the highest bourgeois honours thus: "You must owe the city fathers money nowadays if you want to be made Lord Mayor. Would I do for the job? Driving out of the mansion house, in all my vermin, with Jack here standing up behind me in a powdered wig, eh? I'll make Father Keon my private chaplain. We'll have a family party." Henchy has a sense of humour that springs from his awareness of the country's degradation. This is not a source of grief to him, however. On the contrary, he exploits it. He knows how to make use of circumstances as best he can, for purely selfish ends. He is the anti-idealist, who sees politics as nothing more than a business proposition. The well-told joke may make his audience forget the date of this day, which for Henchy has been profitably employed, but pettiness is apparent in all his jokes and actions. Everything that is done or said is appallingly trivial, even when it is not a matter of vulgar sentiments or cowardice. The assembled agents carry out their campaign, not for a beloved or trusted leader, but for Tricky Dicky, who is known for his untrustworthiness, and who only wants to get some job or other. The agents are not deceived by him, because there is no question of politics in the business for them. They have simply taken temporary jobs as agents, in order to pay some urgent debt, and all that counts is that they should be paid. As they wait, because the trickster with those little pig's eyes for whom they work is in no hurry to honour his debts, they fall back upon the drink, which they have also been awaiting with growing impatience. The scene is indeed far from the majesty of Ireland's uncrowned king. The imaginary presence of Parnell embarrasses them, and the behaviour of these men who live with the times expresses their embarrassment or their excessive joviality. This meeting is quite a close parody of an heroic political gathering, but these Dubliners have assembled at a time when politics is the exact opposite of heroism. Mr. Henchy pretends to act energetically, bustling about, talking loudly, calling for more light and warmth. There can be little honesty and less dignity when the deified leader is replaced by a mean little man whose father was a moneylender and pawnbroker. Worst of all, this downfall is accompanied by a renewal of treachery. There is no longer such a feeling as individual honour, and soon there will be no national honour left either. The only subject which evokes any reaction from the agents' guilty consciences is the possibility of King Edward's projected visit to Ireland. The tone changes abruptly from the sordid to the slanderous. The comedy acts as a disguise for unscrupulousness. For Henchy, for example, the king is not a symbolic figure, and his visit ought not to be treated sentimentally, but accepted for what it is, an opportunity to revive the Irish economy. The king's coming here will mean an influx of money into this country. The citizens of Dublin will benefit by it. We are no longer concerned with freedom, but with profit. It's capital we want. Mr. Henchy takes no account of any sense of honour, for, after all, Parnell is dead. This is of course true, but here it sounds like a repetition of the treachery, a denial of all he stood for. Look at all the money there is in the country if we only worked the old industries, the mills, the shipbuilding yards and factories. Mr. Henchy knows where his interests lie, and Ireland needs money. The citizens, the ratepayers, everyone concerned would benefit if this jolly, fine, decent fellow, Edward VII, came to Dublin. Some of those present feel that they must, rather inconveniently, raise objections. Mr. Lyons points out that King Edward's life, is not the very... But Henchy will not have any moralizing in political matters, and judiciously recommends that they let bygones be bygones. He reminds them that Edward is a human being, which is true, and that he likes his amusements like the rest of them. He's just an ordinary knockabout like you and me. Basically, what can they find in him to complain about? He is a man of the world, and if he were not English, he would have all the qualities of a good Irishman. He's fond of his glass of grog, and he's a bit of a rake, perhaps. And he's a good sportsman. Damn it, can't we Irish play fair? This is a good example of the impeccable logic of treachery. Mr. Lyons is not fully convinced by the argument, though. That's all very fine, but look at the case of Parnell now, he says. But Mr. Henchy replies, where's the analogy between the two cases? In the name of what does Mr. Lyons claim that one can compare Edward with Parnell? But there is no answer. Henchy pretends not to understand the connection, and with the skill of all those who practice the political trade, he changes the subject, ignoring the contradictions of the doubtful morality involved, and acting the part of the generous, forgiving man who reconciles opposing views. Everything falls back into the chaos of degeneracy and lies again. Don't let us stir up any bad blood, says Mr. O'Connor with subtle hypocrisy, quieting his own conscience by this act of reconciliation. We all respect him now that he's dead and gone, he adds, meaning that Parnell no longer frightens us, though while he was alive, his frankness and honesty hindered and embarrassed us because we were cowards. This is what Bloom thought also, in The Cabman's Shelter. Even the Conservatives forgive the adulterer now that he is dead, and respect him because he was a gentleman. Parnell, of course, as gentleman, is not of the same species as Edward, a man of the world, and a jolly, fine, decent fellow, and no damn nonsense about him. Parnell is dead, and nothing need hinder Ireland from welcoming the English king. And so, who is worthy to revive the flame, and who is not unworthy to wear the ivy leaf? Not the younger generation, to judge by old Jack's son, who is at the worst stages of degeneracy. If he is forced to get himself a job, he drinks it all. Another proof is offered by the boy who brings the bottles of stout. Mr. Henchy offers him a drink, much against old Jack's will, and as Jack gives the boy a bottle, he asks him how old he is, as though trying to recall him to sense and health before it is too late. But the lad already knows whom to heed and whom to respect, not the distressed old father, but the tempter Henchy. That's the way it begins, says the old man. But in fact, that is how it ends. They suddenly remember that today is the anniversary of Parnell's death, and feel slightly embarrassed by this. Parnell exists so little that when the need to communicate is felt, they do not know quite what to do, not having thought of preparing any ceremony. Hines, who had vanished during the discussion, as though Joyce had obscurely wished to keep him from being a witness to this deadly wake, now returns, and the vague Parnell wake that takes place has this in common with the wake for Finnegan the mason, that if the shade of Parnell has made even a timid appearance in people's minds, they have hastened to reduce it again to its customary impotence, and similarly the guests at the wake persuade Tim Finnegan, whom the scent of whiskey has recalled to life, to lie down again. Parnell, however, resembles Hamlet's father much more than he resembles Finnegan, and whatever they do to exorcise him, he remains firmly ensconced in the individual conscience. At the end, Joyce's intention is to evoke more concretely the death of the leader, because the presence of their eternally absent king is so strongly felt by all the characters, as it was felt by Joyce himself, as a perpetual reproach and remorse for their decadent state. Through a paradox which represents the highest achievement of his deceptively realistic art in Dubliners, Joyce is, in the writing of Ivy Day, doubly present. He is every Irishman, and thereby guilty of the murder of Parnell. And he also is Parnell, invincible but present behind every line and every word, to such an extent that one can sense his irony informing everything that is said. It is all written down in the characters' uneasy consciences. Mr. Henchy shamelessly invites Joe Hines to recite, "That thing you wrote," as though to demonstrate that the break between living present and dead past is complete, and that Parnell henceforth belongs to literature rather than to history. The poem is ambiguous. What the metaphor actually alludes to and what it makes manifest can be interpreted on many levels, some of them liable to become mutually contradictory, and we must examine all of these levels and not just the apparently literary one which is the first to be perceived. The thematic tension thus established acts upon the reader's mind, making him sensitive to the smallest variations in tone, and The Death of Parnell is seen to be a poem of several different degrees of irony. To begin with, there is the literal irony of reciting a poem of grief and indignation to an audience that remains completely cold and unmoved. Then, by its relationship with this audience, the poem acquires an aggressive tone because Parnell died betrayed by people whose description, modern hypocrites, coward hounds, identifies them with the audience, who are complacently listening to the poem. They behave as though they were not the people being criticized in the poem, as though they had nothing to do with it, and applaud their own condemnation. Next, the irony becomes historical too. The contrast is established between the message of hope, which the poet cries prayerfully towards the future, and the reality of this future, made concrete as the moment in which the poem is being read, and the hope is seen to be both vain and ridiculous. His spirit may rise like the phoenix from the flames when breaks the dawning of the day, cries the poet, and on this echo of the Psalms, the fire in the grate goes out. Erin is compared to an Eastern queen who sees all the hopes of her life perish on the pyre where her dead king is burned. He lies slain by the coward hounds he raised to glory from the mire, and Erin's hopes and Erin's dreams perish upon her monarch's pyre. In palace, cabin, or in cot, the Irish heart, where'er it be, is bowed with woe, for he is gone. Who would have wrought her destiny? He would have had his Erin famed. The green flag gloriously unfurled, her statesmen, bards, and warriors raised before the nations of the world. He dreamed, alas, 'twas but a dream, of liberty, but as he strove to clutch that idol, treachery sundered him from the thing he loved. Yet in reality, Erin had taken great delight in raising that pyre and in burning her hopes and dreams, for fear that they might come true. Insensibly the distance grows between Parnell's death, theatrically deplored as a great loss, and the real indifference of his so-called followers, between the tragedy of the hero's death and the meanness of the chorus who bewail it, between the swollen rhetoric of the lamentations that are recited and the actual paucity of the Dubliners' vocabulary, between the dead dream and the living nightmare. And as it grows, the irony is further modified. Read before an innocent audience, it would simply be an expression of some puerile optimism. But to a guilty audience, it denounces their crimes clearly and candidly. Hines reciting the death of Parnell is like the actors in Hamlet acting out the murder of a king before the king's murderer. The whole tragedy is in Claudius's silence. Similarly, when Hines finishes his poem, there is a silence lasting for a moment, while everyone hastens to adjust his mind to the consciousness of guilt and to decide on the appropriate behavior to adopt. This moment of mutual admission of guilt is broken by their applause, for the guilty have found their line of defense and their reply to the indirect accusation. They choose the role of spectators, excusing themselves thus from any responsibility, and they congratulate the poet on his mastery of the art. Yet there was that moment in which Parnell almost began to exist again, that silence which he occupied so fully that he almost returned to them, and in that silence, that moment, was produced their awareness of the discord between the last verse and its echo in time present, in actuality as they knew it. It was not the silence of shamefaced reluctance to speak, but the silence in which the dishonourable Dubliner was faced with the image of the honourable man who was to exist when Parnell returned, when freedom ruled, in the psalmist's ideal future. And on that day may Erin well pledge in the cup she lifts to joy one grief, the memory of Parnell. Each knows that the memory of Parnell is only a form of remorse, and each lifts the bitter drink of guilty conscience to his lips. But no toast is drunk to freedom, because they are soon to drink to King Edward. All of the themes which could have led to tragedy have been turned aside into farce.